He was covered in tattoos, raising his son alone and fixing broken machines in a Pittsburgh back alley, and she humiliated him in front of 300 people without blinking. What she didn't know was that the man she had just dismissed as a nobody had built the very empire she was standing in, and someone inside that empire had spent 10 years making sure she would never find out. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Part 1. The Man Nobody Looked At Twice. The morning started the way most of Jackson Reed's mornings did, badly and without warning. He was crouched under a 1960s linotype press that had no business still existing, let alone being in his workshop, when his son's voice cut through the hiss of the space heater and the grinding complaint of the machine's ink rollers. "Dad, you're bleeding again." Jackson pulled his hand back from the gear housing and looked at the slice across his thumb. Not deep, just irritating. He pressed it against his jeans and kept working. "I'm fine." "You said that last time and then you wrapped it in a paper towel for 3 days. Paper towels are underrated." 8-year-old Miles Reed stood in the workshop doorway in his school coat, backpack half zipped, watching his father with the particular expression he had developed over the past year. Part exasperation, part something older than exasperation, something a kid his age shouldn't have needed to develop yet. He had his mother's eyes, dark and steady, the kind that didn't let things go easily. "Bus comes in 11 minutes, Miles said. "I know. You said that last Tuesday, and I missed it." Last Tuesday was a one-time incident. It was also a Wednesday. Jackson stood up, wiped both hands on a shop rag, and reached for the small first aid kit mounted on the wall between a pegboard of wrenches and a faded photograph he hadn't moved in 4 years. He wrapped his thumb without looking at the photograph. He had gotten good at that. "Come here," he said. Miles crossed the workshop floor, stepping over a disassembled timing belt with the practiced ease of a kid who had grown up around machinery. Jackson zipped the backpack the rest of the way, checked that his lunch was actually inside, adjusted the left strap that always rode too high on Miles's shoulder. "What's the rule?" Jackson said. "Don't touch the press." "The other rule," Miles sighed. "Don't tell people what you used to do." "Right." "Why does that matter?" Jackson picked up his jacket from the workbench. "Because people treat you different when they think you're something. And I like things the way they are." Miles considered this with the same quiet patience he brought to most things. He was not a dramatic kid, not prone to outbursts. He processed things and then came back to them later, sometimes days later, with a question you had already forgotten you'd opened. He got that from his mother, too. "Mr. Harmon at school says you fix old machines," Miles said. "I do." He said, "It sounds boring." "Mr. Harmon drives a lease car and eats lunch at his desk. I wouldn't lose sleep over his opinions." That pulled a half smile out of Miles, which was the best result most mornings. He pulled his hood up against the November air and pushed through the side door into the gray Pittsburgh morning. Jackson stood in the doorway and watched him go until the end of the alley. Then he went back to the linotype. The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on the edge of the Strip District, sandwiched between a wholesale flooring company and a place that sold reclaimed lumber. The neighborhood was in that particular phase of urban reinvention where expensive coffee shops and murals of local jazz musicians shared the block with tire shops and produce distributors who had been there for 40 years. Jackson had taken the lease 6 years ago because the ceilings were high, the rent was manageable, and the landlord, a retired machinist named Gerald, hadn't asked him anything beyond whether he could pay on time and whether he minded the occasional mice. He had told Gerald yes and yes. They had gotten along fine ever since. The work itself was niche in the way that only a dying industry can be niche, which is to say, there was no market for it, and yet somehow there was always work. Museums, collectors, historic printing societies, universities with engineering programs that like to restore things as teaching exercises. He fixed letterpress machines, mechanical calculators, early model industrial looms, occasionally the internal mechanisms of old pipe organs. The kind of equipment that required patience and a specific kind of thinking, the kind that started not with the broken part, but with understanding what the machine had been designed to do in the first place. Work backward from the purpose. Trace the logic of the original engineer. Find the point of failure. He was good at it. He had always been good at that particular kind of thinking. He just didn't talk about why. The call came at 10:30 while he was cleaning the ink channels on the linotype with a cotton swab and a patience that had taken years to build. Unknown number, Pittsburgh area code. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Reed. The voice was older, male, formal in a way that people weren't anymore, unless they were over 70 or had spent their lives inside institutions that still cared about such things. My name is Leonard Cross. I believe we have some history worth discussing. Jackson set the cotton swab down. He knew the name. He had spent years making sure he didn't have to hear it. I'm not interested, he said. I imagine not. I wouldn't be either in your position. A pause, then something that might have been a dry cough or a short laugh. I'm calling because I owe you something I should have given you a long time ago. And because I'm 78 years old and I've recently been informed that my heart has opinions about my schedule. I'd prefer to address this while I still can. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Through the workshop window, he could see a pigeon working through something it had found on the sidewalk. The November light was flat and gray and the kind of cold that came from clouds, not temperature. What are you saying to me? Jackson asked. I'm saying that I know what you built. I'm saying that the company I've spent my life growing is standing on a foundation you laid, and you've never been credited for it, compensated for it, or even thanked for it. I'm saying that I'm ashamed of that, and that I intend to do something about it. It's been 10 years. I know. A lot happened in those 10 years. Another pause, this one heavier. I know that too. I'm sorry about your wife. Jackson looked at the linotype, at the photograph, at his thumb, still wrapped in its clean bandage. I'll think about it, he said, and ended the call. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to the ink channels, and he worked until noon without stopping, because that was the only thing that reliably cleared his head. He thought about it for 3 days. He thought about it while he installed a replacement mainspring and a mechanical calculator for a collector in Squirrel Hill. He thought about it while he made Miles's lunch and argued with him about whether cereal counted as a breakfast food or whether it had secretly always been a dessert. He thought about it in the 15 minutes every night after Miles went to sleep and before Jackson could get himself to follow, those 15 minutes that had become the most dangerous part of every day for no reason he could ever fully explain. What he kept coming back to was not the money, not the credit, not the patent question that had haunted the edges of his awareness for a decade. What he kept coming back to was something much simpler and much harder to name. He wanted to look at the thing that had broken him and know he was still standing. That was probably not a sufficient reason to walk back into the world he had left, but it was the reason he had. So on the 4th day he called Leonard Cross back, told him he would come to the gala, and then immediately wondered what the hell he had been thinking. He did not own a suit. This was not something he had thought about in years, the way people don't think about the skills they've let go until they suddenly need them again. He had suits once, good ones, the kind that came with that particular weight of fabric that said, money without announcing it. He had left all of them in a storage unit in San Francisco when he moved east, and he had never gone back for them. Gerald, his landlord, was a thick man in his late 60s who dressed exclusively in canvas work pants and plaid shirts, and who had, somehow, a complete tuxedo hanging in the back of his garage that he claimed to have worn to his daughter's wedding 11 years ago. The tuxedo was a size too large for Jackson in the shoulders and a half-inch too short in the leg, and when Jackson put it on in Gerald's garage, the older man stood back and studied him with the expression of a man choosing his words carefully. It's fine, Gerald said. Is it? It's a tuxedo. You've got the arms for it. That's most of the battle. The arms were, objectively, a problem in the opposite direction. Jackson's were too heavily built for the jacket to sit quite right, and the tattoos that covered both forearms to the knuckles didn't exactly disappear just because the sleeves were dark wool. The ink ran up his neck, too. A single unbroken design that had grown from something small and specific into something he could no longer fully explain even to himself, added to over years, each piece tied to something he didn't want to forget. Gerald drove him to the gala venue, a restored industrial building downtown that had been converted into the kind of event space that charged $4,000 a night, and rolled down the truck window as Jackson got out. "Don't let anyone give you grief," Gerald said. "I won't." "I mean it. You've got just as much right to be wherever you decide to be." Jackson looked at him. Gerald was not a man who said things like that casually. "Appreciate it," Jackson said. He turned and went inside. The event was, in the precise language that money spoke, immaculate. Catering staff moved through the crowd in clean black uniforms with practiced invisibility. The centerpieces on the tables were either works of contemporary art or a joke about contemporary art. He couldn't tell which, and he suspected that was intentional. The guests were of the particular variety that had learned to wear their wealth in the spaces between things. The deliberate understatement of the watch, the specific drape of the jacket, the way they introduced themselves without mentioning their company first, because everyone already knew it. Crosstech Industries hosted this event annually, and everyone who mattered in Pittsburgh's technology and business landscape turned up for it, along with people from New York, Boston, Chicago, and points further. It raised money for causes the company supported, and it served as a public demonstration of Crosstech's endurance and ambition. It was, in short, the kind of event that Jackson had attended many times in another life, and had hoped never to attend again. He moved through it carefully, staying near the walls, holding a glass of water he didn't drink. He was looking for Leonard Cross. What he found first was Vivian Cross. He didn't know who she was immediately. He was crossing the room near the entrance to the main hall, angling toward the cluster of older men near the far bar where he had been told Leonard would be when he heard her voice. Sharp, carrying, the kind that cut through a crowded room without effort. "Excuse me." He stopped, looked. She was 32, though she carried herself in a way that made age seem irrelevant. Dark hair pulled back tightly, a dark blue dress that was almost severe in its simplicity, which he understood now was a kind of power. The message that she didn't need anything ornamental. She was talking to him, or rather, she was talking at him, which was different. "The deliveries come around the back," she said. "There's a separate entrance on Stanwix. You'll want to take the service elevator." Jackson looked at her. The room had not gone fully quiet. That would have required more than one voice. But the small bubble of space around them had developed the specific stillness of people who had heard something and were deciding whether to pay more attention. "I'm sorry?" he said. "The service entrance," she said again, and her tone had the particular patience of someone explaining something for the second time to someone they expected to need a third. "This is a private event. If you're delivering something, you'll need to check in with logistics downstairs." The nearest guests had stopped their own conversations now. Jackson looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the people around them. He did the math. "I'm not a delivery person," he said. Vivian Cross blinked. A very small adjustment. He could see her recalibrating, not apologizing, not yet, but reorganizing. Her eyes moved down his jacket, his arms, back to his face. Whatever reorganization she had been doing, it didn't land anywhere she liked. "This is a private event," she said again. "Do you have an invitation?" "I do." "Then perhaps you could show me—" "Vivian." The voice came from behind her, older, tired, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the evening. Leonard Cross had crossed the room at a pace that, for a 78-year-old man with a bad heart, was more than he should have attempted. He reached his granddaughter's side and looked at Jackson with something complicated in his face. Not quite guilt. Something more specific than guilt. "He's my guest," Leonard said quietly. The room processed this. Vivian processed it too, though her face showed almost nothing. Almost. There was a tightening at the corner of her jaw that she didn't manage in time. "Your guest," she said. "Yes." Leonard looked at Jackson. "I'm glad you came." Jackson looked at Vivian Cross for another second, long enough to make the point without making a scene. And then he looked at Leonard. "Let's find somewhere to talk," Jackson said. He walked with Leonard toward the back of the room. He did not look back. Behind him, the small bubble of silence dissolved into conversation. They found a quiet room off the main hall, a green room of sorts, used for speakers before they went on. There was a couch, a folding table with a water pitcher and cups, and a mirror that neither of them looked at. Leonard Cross sat heavily. He was thinner than his photographs, which was saying something. His hands on his knees were the hands of a man who had always been larger than he was now. "I apologize for my granddaughter," he said. "You don't need to." "I do. She's under extraordinary pressure. That doesn't excuse it, but I want you to understand that she isn't typically—" "Mr. Cross," Jackson said, "I didn't come here for an apology about tonight. You said on the phone that you had something to tell me." Leonard looked at him. There was a tiredness in him that Jackson recognized as the particular kind that comes not from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying something that should have been set down long ago. "Sit down," Leonard said. Jackson sat. "What I'm about to tell you," Leonard said slowly, "I should have told you 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, or any point before tonight. The fact that I didn't is the worst failure of my life, and I've had several." He paused. The technology that launched Crosstech into the Fortune 500, the adaptive processing architecture that we patented in 2015 and that has since been licensed to 19 major technology companies, you built it. I know I built it. Not most of it, not partially. You built all of it, the core architecture, the efficiency framework, the entire theoretical foundation that everything else was layered onto. Leonard's voice did not waver. And the patents are registered under other names. Names that were put there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Who?" he said. "Damian Cole." The name registered. He placed it, a face from 10 years back, a man who had been mid-level management when Jackson was still at the company. Ambitious. Personable in the specific way of people who have learned to perform personality. He had been at the edges of meetings, always, asking the right questions at the right times. "He was my COO for the past 7 years," Leonard said. "I trusted him completely. He presented himself as the architect of the company's growth." A pause. "I believed him." Jackson looked at the water pitcher. He did not pour a cup. "Jackson," Leonard said, and it was the first time he had used the first name. "When you left the company after Renata died, I should have looked more closely at what happened. I should have asked better questions. Instead, I was grieving myself, and I was overwhelmed, and Damien was there with answers and confidence and a plan, and I let him lead." He stopped. "I've been a foolish old man." "You're telling me now," Jackson said. "I'm telling you now because 3 days ago my assistant found a discrepancy in the foundation's accounts. The Renata Reed Foundation, the one we established after—" He stopped. "After. I've been looking at the numbers for 3 days, and I need you to understand what I'm beginning to think is happening." He took a folder from beside him on the couch and held it out. Jackson took it. He opened it. He read for a long time. The numbers were clear. The foundation, which was supposed to have dispersed grants to families dealing with the disease that had taken Renata, had instead been systematically drained over 6 years through a pattern of vendor payments, consulting invoices, and administrative expenses that, on their face, looked routine and on closer inspection led to shell companies that didn't exist. $2,700,000. He closed the folder. "Have you told Vivian?" he asked. "Not yet. She's the CEO. She is, and she's not involved in this. I want to be clear about that. Vivian is many things, but she is not this." Leonard leaned forward. "But I need to tell her, and when I do, I need her to understand who you are, what the company owes you, because what's coming is going to require her to trust someone she just embarrassed in front of 300 people." Jackson held the folder in his hands. He thought about Miles sleeping at home with Gerald watching from the house next door, the way they had arranged. He thought about the photograph in the workshop. He thought about the morning he had walked out of a building in San Francisco for the last time, carrying nothing but a backpack because everything else had felt like it belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. He thought about $2,700,000 raised in his wife's name that had gone into someone's pocket. "Tell her," Jackson said. He stood up. "Tell her tonight." So, he found Leonard's assistant, a young woman named Priya, who wore the expression of someone who had been managing too many crises for too long, and asked her to keep his presence quiet for the rest of the evening. She agreed without asking why, which told him everything he needed to know about how the night was already going. He moved back into the main event, staying on the outer edges, drinking the water this time. The crowd had settled back into its rhythms. The humiliation in the main hall was already calcifying into anecdote, the kind of story that would circulate through the evening with increasing embellishment and that would be forgotten by morning. He watched Vivian cross from across the room. She was at the center of a conversation near the stage, 3 guests and 2 board members, and he could tell from the body language that she was the one doing the work, the organizing of attention, the redirecting of energy, the quiet management of whatever the conversation wanted to become. She was good at it. He could see that, even without hearing the words. She was very good at it, and it was costing her something, the set of her shoulders, the specific brand of alertness behind her eyes that was not enthusiasm but discipline. He had seen that look before. He had worn it himself for years. He turned away before she looked in his direction and moved toward the exit. Outside, he called Gerald. "How's Miles?" "Asleep an hour ago. We watched that cartoon first, the one with the dinosaurs." "Good. How was the party?" Jackson looked up at the sky over Pittsburgh. The clouds were low and orange with reflected light. Somewhere below them, the city was doing whatever cities did at 11 o'clock on a Thursday. "Informative," he said. "That sounds terrible." "Some of it was. Come home." He stood there another minute after he ended the call, not quite ready to leave the conversation he had walked into and the one he had agreed to continue. Then the cold got specific enough to move him, and he walked to the end of the block to wait for the rideshare he had called, standing under a streetlight with his hands in his pockets and Leonard Cross's folder folded inside his jacket against his chest. He thought about the patents. He thought about the foundation. He thought about Damian Cole's face, which he was now trying to reconstruct from memory, and the careful way the man had always positioned himself at the edge of things rather than the center. He thought about how you spend 10 years building a structure that looks like stability, and how, if the person who built the original foundation decides to say something, the whole thing comes apart from the bottom. He wondered how long Damian had been watching for that. He wondered if Damian had been watching him specifically. The rideshare arrived. He got in. He was home before midnight. He took off the tuxedo, hung it on the door, and stood in the workshop for a while in the dark without turning on the lights. He could see the outlines of things, the linotype, the tool cabinet, the crates of parts, the faded photograph. He pressed his hand flat against the workbench. The surface was solid, cold, covered in grease and the small, honest scars of real use. He stood there until the things that were moving in his chest slowed down enough that he could recognize them for what they were. Not grief, not anger, exactly. Something older than both. Something he had thought he had put away. The knowledge that he had built something that mattered and that it had been taken from him, and that for 10 years he had told himself that not fighting for it was a kind of peace and not a kind of surrender. He had believed it because he needed to. He wasn't sure he believed it anymore. He went to the corner of the workshop behind the lumber shelves that Gerald had helped him build 3 years ago, and he moved 2 stacked crates aside. Behind them was the wall. In the wall was a panel, secured not with a lock, but with a specific pressure at a specific point, a trick from a childhood spent watching his father modify the interiors of old houses. He pressed it, and the panel opened on its hinges. Inside, a fireproof safe, 9 inches by 12, sitting on a shelf built specifically to hold it. He had not opened it in 6 years. He spun the combination, which he still remembered without trying. He opened the door. Inside were 9 composition notebooks, a padded envelope containing a set of USB drives, a folder of documents with a rubber band around it, and 2 envelopes sealed with tape. He looked at these things for a long time. He closed the safe. He moved the crates back. He went upstairs to bed. Miles was asleep in his room, one arm hanging off the side of the mattress, his hair in the specific state of chaos it achieved by the middle of the night, his face completely relaxed in the way that children's faces were in sleep. Open, unguarded, not yet practiced in whatever neutral expression the world would eventually teach him. Jackson adjusted the blanket, picked up the arm, and set it on the mattress. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he went to his own room and lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to stop hiding and what it would cost and whether he was willing to pay it. He didn't have the answer by the time he fell asleep, but the question was already different now. The question had a name attached to it, and the name was Damian Cole. And for the first time in 6 years, the thing Jackson felt when he thought about that name was not exhaustion. It was something precise and cold and quietly determined. Something that felt, if he was being honest with himself, like the beginning of a fight. Vivian Cross did not sleep that night either, though for entirely different reasons. She sat in her grandfather's study on the 14th floor of the Cross family's private residence, a floor above the Cross Tech executive suites, connected by a private elevator that Leonard had installed 30 years ago and that nobody else used, with the folder open on the desk in front of her, and a cup of tea she had made 40 minutes ago and not touched. Leonard sat in the chair across from her. He had changed out of his evening clothes. He looked smaller in his gray sweater, like a man who had been carrying something for so long that the shape of it had become load-bearing, and now that he had set it down, he didn't quite know how to stand straight. Vivian had read through the folder twice. The second time more slowly, going back over the vendor transactions, cross-referencing the dates against the Foundation's public filings, which she had pulled up on her laptop while Leonard watched her without speaking. She set the folder down. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the discrepancy, 3 days. About Jackson. About who he really is and what he built." Leonard paused. "I've suspected for longer than I've admitted, even to myself." Vivian looked at him. There was something she wanted to say that she couldn't quite shape into language. It lived somewhere between hurt and a tiredness she didn't have room for tonight. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because I was ashamed." He met her eyes. "Because I built this company, Vivian. I built it, and I handed it to you to carry, and I needed to believe that what I handed you was clean, that the foundation was solid, that Damian was what he appeared to be." He stopped. "I was wrong. About all of it." She was quiet for a while. Outside the window, Pittsburgh was dark and calm, the river catching the city's lights in long, broken lines. "He was right there," she said. "He was in every meeting. He reviewed every acquisition, every partnership, every—" She stopped. "I trusted him. So did I. I brought him into the leadership review last spring. I defended him to the board when Marcus questioned his expense accounts." She pushed back from the desk, stood up. The room was too small for what she was feeling, and she moved to the window because it was the only direction available. Marcus was right. Marcus had one data point and a personal dislike. You had a company to run. Don't do that to yourself. Someone has to. "Later," Leonard said. "Right now I need you to focus. The fire." "What fire?" He told her. While they had been sitting in the gala's green room, while Jackson had been standing under that streetlight waiting for his car, someone had broken into the archive facility Crosstech maintained in a warehouse district 15 miles outside the city. The security system had reported an anomaly at 11:42, and by the time the alarm company had dispatched, the anomaly had turned into a fire. Small, controlled, surgical. The sprinklers had handled it before the fire department arrived, but the section of the archive that burned had held physical records from the company's first 5 years of operation, patent development files, engineering correspondence, internal memos from the R&D period, exactly the records that would establish who had built what and when. Vivian pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. A habit. Something she did when the information was arriving faster than the structure she used to process it. "That's not a coincidence," she said. "No." "He knows. Damian knows you talked to Jackson." Leonard said nothing. "Or he knows you were going to." She turned from the window. "Who knew about the call? About inviting him to the gala?" "Priya, my driver. Damian's assistant may have seen the name in my calendar. I wasn't careful. I should have been careful." "You shouldn't have had to be careful about who attends your own events." "I know." She stood in the middle of the room with her hands clasped behind her back, which was what she did when she was thinking hard enough that the rest of her body became a distraction. She was thinking about the foundation accounts, and the archive fire, and the man she had dismissed at the entrance to her own event. The tattooed man in the borrowed suit who had looked at her for exactly 1 second too long after her grandfather appeared and had chosen, deliberately, visibly, not to say whatever he had decided not to say. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She filed it. "I want the security footage from the archive," she said, "not through company channels, privately. I want to know who authorized the access before the fire." "Vivian, and I want to see Jackson Reed." Leonard looked at her. "He may not want to see you." "I know." She picked up her phone from the desk. "I'm going to ask him anyway." She didn't ask him that night. She drafted the message twice, deleted it both times, and went to bed at 2 in the morning with the folder on the nightstand and the numbers from the foundation accounts running patterns in her head that she couldn't stop following. She slept for 4 hours. She woke up before the alarm. The office was quiet when she arrived at 6. She liked the office at 6, the absence of performance that came with the absence of people, the way the space felt like what it actually was, rather than what everyone was presenting inside it. She made her own coffee in the executive kitchen and sat at her desk with the financial files she had pulled together overnight. She had a system for hard problems, had developed it years ago when she first took the CEO position at 29 and realized almost immediately that the job was mostly a series of situations where reasonable people disagreed and the information available was insufficient and a decision had to be made anyway. You built a system because instinct alone was unreliable, and the pressure to act on it was constant. You mapped what you knew, what you suspected, and what you needed to confirm. You ranked by urgency. You moved. She mapped Damien. 7 years as COO. Brilliant at operations. She had not invented that assessment. Every external review confirmed it. Clean performance record. No formal complaints. Relationships with the board that predated her tenure and that she had, until now, considered an asset. He was personable without being warm, ambitious in the specific way that read as drive rather than hunger. He had been at Leonard's side when she stepped into the CEO role, had briefed her patiently, had smoothed the transitions she hadn't known needed smoothing. She had liked him. She thought about that while she drank her coffee, the way liking someone made you a worse observer of them, the way trust created exactly the kind of blind spot that a careful person would learn to exploit. She opened her laptop and started reading everything she could access about Jackson Reed. There was not much, which was itself a thing. A man who had worked in technology long enough to be credited on meaningful patents did not usually disappear completely from the record. There were traces, conference proceedings from 2011 and 2012, where a J. Reed appeared in the author list on papers about adaptive processing architectures. A mention in a trade publication from 2013 about a team at an unnamed startup working on next-generation compression algorithms. An obituary from 2014 for Renata Reed, survived by her husband Jackson, and no children listed. Miles would have been born the previous year, she noted, very young to be losing a parent. After 2014, almost nothing. A business registration for a sole proprietorship in Pittsburgh. A brief mention in a local paper's feature on craftspeople restoring antique machinery. A photograph taken from outside his workshop that she stared at for longer than she meant to. He didn't look like someone hiding. He looked like someone who had decided the world outside the workshop was not worth the commute. She sent the message. "Mr. Reed, my name is Vivian Cross. I believe we need to speak. I recognize I have given you no reason to trust me, and I'm not asking you to. I'm asking for an hour of your time, at a location of your choosing, at your convenience. My grandfather has shared enough with me that I understand what I said to you last night was wrong. I also believe there are things happening that affect both of us and that require us to work together. I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. V. Cross." She read it twice, changed wrong to inexcusable, changed it back to wrong because inexcusable sounded like she was fishing for absolution, and sent it. She did not expect a quick reply. He replied in 40 minutes. "Workshop. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Come alone." She came alone. The Strip District on a Tuesday morning was fully awake. Produce trucks double-parked outside wholesalers, the smell of coffee and river air, a jackhammer somewhere in the middle distance. She found the workshop without difficulty, recognized it from the photograph, and stood outside the door for a moment before knocking because she had not entirely decided what she was going to say. She knocked. "It's open." She pushed the door. The space was larger than it looked from outside. High ceilings, the smell of machine oil and old metal, natural light from a row of windows along the upper wall. There was a massive piece of equipment along one wall that she couldn't identify. Something with rollers and an ink reservoir and a level of mechanical complexity that seemed at odds with the size of the room. Pegboards of tools, labeled shelves, organized in the way that spaces get organized when one person uses them alone for years. Jackson Reed was at a workbench in the center. He looked different without the borrowed tuxedo. Jeans, a worn flannel over a gray thermal. The tattoos she had already noticed were more visible now. The ink on his neck and the backs of his hands, the detail that ran up his forearms when he pushed the flannel sleeves up. He was doing something with a small mechanical assembly, and he didn't put it down when she came in. "Sit," he said, without looking up. There was a stool near the workbench. She sat. She waited, because he was clearly going to make her wait, and she had decided on the way over that she would not make that into something. It wasn't disrespect, it was information. He was telling her that this was his space and his time, and that she was operating on his terms, which she understood, and which she deserved. He set the assembly down after another minute and looked at her. "You drove yourself," he said. "You said come alone." "I meant without security. I don't use personal security." He considered this. "Most people in your position do." "Most people in my position feel like they need to." She met his eyes. "I've never liked the idea of it." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. He reached for a rag and cleaned his hands. "What do you know?" he said. She told him everything. The foundation accounts, the archive fire, the pattern she had mapped overnight. She was precise about it. Numbers, dates, names. She did not editorialize. She watched his face while she talked, the way it processed information. Very still, very focused, with occasional small movements that told her he was connecting what she was saying to things he already knew. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The fire happened the same night," he said. "Yes." "Which means someone knew your grandfather had contacted me before the gala. Or they found out fast." "Yes." "How many people have access to your archive facilities access logs?" "Facilities management and the COO's office." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "Does Damien know what you know?" "I haven't spoken to him since before the gala. I've been careful." She paused. "I'm good at not showing what I'm thinking." I noticed. She wasn't sure how to take that. She moved past it. "There's something else. I had someone look at the patent filings from 2014 and 2015, the ones connected to Crosstech's core technology. The engineers named on those patents, 2 of them left the company within a year of filing. One is in Singapore, one is in Toronto. I haven't been able to reach either of them." Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. "I knew those guys," he said. "Marcus Teal and Danny Cha." "Do you know why they left?" "At the time I was told they took better offers." He stood up from the workbench, moved to the window. His back was to her for a moment. "I was in no condition to ask better questions. My wife died 6 months before the patents were filed. He stopped. "I was somewhere else." "I'm sorry," she said. He turned around. "Are you saying that because you mean it or because you think it's what I want to hear?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm saying it because I read her obituary and she was 30 years old and you were dealing with that and someone used it. Someone watched you grieve and calculated that you weren't going to be paying attention to paperwork. And they moved." She stopped. "That's a specific kind of cruelty. I'm sorry it happened." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully read. Then he looked away, and when he looked back, it was gone, sealed over. "The archive fire," he said. "It was the physical records. What about digital?" "Some of it is on servers I control. Some of it—" She hesitated. "Some of it Damien's office manages. I've been operating on the assumption that whatever is on those servers should be considered compromised." "Smart. What I don't have is the original engineering documentation, the kind of thing that would establish who built the core architecture and when. Testimony from the engineers who were there." She looked at him. "Or anything that was kept outside the company system." He was quiet. She waited. I need to ask you something directly, she said, and I need you to answer it directly. Go ahead. Do you have documentation? Your own records kept separately. Anything that would establish your role before Damien could have modified or destroyed the company records. The pause was long enough that she thought he was going to refuse to answer. Why are you the one coming to me? He said instead. You're the CEO. You have lawyers, investigators, a board. The board has 3 members who were appointed on Damien's recommendation. I don't know how far this goes or who else is involved. If I move through official channels before I understand the full scope, I risk tipping him off before I have enough to be conclusive. She kept her voice level. And because my grandfather asked me to trust you, and because I think he's right, and I'm not in the habit of ignoring him when he's right. Jackson looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. What's your read on the board? He said finally. The ones you do trust. Eleanor Marsh and Robert Fenn, both independent directors, both legacy appointments from the company's early years. Both old enough to remember when Crosstech was small enough that the details of who built what actually mattered. Eleanor Marsh, he repeated, as if the name meant something to him. You know her? She used to come to the R&D floor sometimes, bring sandwiches, ask actual questions about the work. Something crossed his face, brief. She was the only board member who ever did. Vivian filed that. She's been asking me questions lately about the foundation accounts. I've been deflecting because I didn't have answers. I'm not going to deflect anymore. Jackson pushed off the windowsill. He moved to the shelves at the back of the workshop, stood there a moment with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. There's a problem, he said. What problem? If I show what I have and we take it through official channels and it works, the company acknowledges what happened, the patents are reassigned, Damien goes down. He paused. My son's name is in this too, his mother's name, the foundation. I need to know that what happens next isn't going to pull him into something he's not old enough to understand. She hadn't expected that. She should have. She took a moment. He won't be involved, she said. My commitment to you, and I understand I'm in no position to be making commitments right now, but I'm making this one, is that whatever happens with the company, Miles stays out of it completely. His name, his life, none of it becomes part of the public narrative unless you choose it to be. And the foundation? Restored, fully, every dollar. She paused. More than fully, if I have anything to say about it. He was still, looking at the shelves without seeing them. There's something you need to know, he said. About the archive fire. She waited. If Damien's burning records, it's because he's scared. That's a reactive move, not a calculated one, which means he doesn't know exactly what exists outside the company system and he's covering ground. He turned around. Which means he knows something is coming, but he doesn't know how much. Which means we have a window. Short one. Then we shouldn't waste it. She stood up from the stool. Will you show me what you have? He looked at her for what felt like the last test of something. Then he moved to the back of the workshop, behind the lumber shelves, and she watched him move 2 stacked crates aside. She watched him press a point on the wall and a panel open. She watched him spin a combination into a safe she hadn't known was there. He opened it and stood aside so she could see the interior. 9 composition notebooks, a padded envelope, a folder with a rubber band around it, 2 sealed envelopes. She looked at the notebooks. Their spines were dated. The earliest 2010, the latest 2014. She looked at the padded envelope, which was labeled in handwriting she would later come to recognize immediately. USB, Working Files, Adaptive Processing Architecture, V1 to V7. This is everything, he said. Not a question, a statement about what she was looking at. When was the last time you opened it? 6 years ago. She looked at him. She did not ask why he had kept it. She understood why he had kept it. Some part of him had always known this day would come, even if he had spent 6 years telling himself otherwise. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The workshop settled around them, the hiss of the space heater, the ambient sounds of the street outside, the particular quality of silence that filled spaces where old machines waited to be understood. I need a few days, he said, to make copies, organize what's here into something you can actually present. I know someone who can help with the technical side, someone I trust completely, outside the company. I'll handle the technical side myself. All right? She moved toward the door, then she stopped. Mr. Reed? He looked at her. The thing I said to you at the gala. She looked at him directly. No deflection. I looked at you and made a calculation in about 4 seconds based on what you looked like and where you were standing, and I was wrong, and I said it in front of people, and I'm not going to pretend that a text message apology covered it. He said nothing. He was watching her with that same quality of attention he brought to the machines, careful, without projection, trying to understand what something was actually designed to do. I'm telling you this not because I need you to accept it, she continued, but because I think you deserve to hear it said out loud in your own space, without an audience. She paused. That's all. She pushed the door open and walked out into the Strip District morning. Behind her, she heard him say something. She wasn't sure she was meant to hear it. She kept walking. It was only half a block later in the noise of the street that she processed what it had been. I know. Just that. 2 words. Not forgiveness, not dismissal. An acknowledgement. The specific kind that only came from someone who had already done the work of deciding not to carry it. She walked back to her car. She had a meeting at noon she wasn't going to cancel because canceling it would signal something she wasn't ready to signal. She would sit across from Damian Cole at the leadership table this afternoon, and she would look at him the way she always looked at him, and she would give him absolutely nothing. She was, it turned out, very good at that. The leadership meeting that afternoon lasted 90 minutes. Vivian sat at the head of the table and ran it the way she ran every meeting. Structured, efficient, moving through the agenda items with enough pace that people stayed focused and enough pause that no one felt steamrolled. She asked questions. She listened to answers. She wrote 3 things in her notebook and crossed out one of them. Damian Cole sat at her left, which was where he always sat. He had a yellow legal pad, which was an affectation she had always found slightly odd in a man who otherwise embraced every digital tool available. He took notes by hand during meetings. He said it helped him think. She had never questioned it. She watched him now the way you watched something after you understood what it actually was. Not obviously. She had years of practice at directing her attention without directing her eyes. A skill she had developed early in boardrooms where being visibly too interested in something was itself a form of information transfer. He looked exactly as he always looked, attentive, measured, occasionally deferential in the way that powerful people perform deference, not because they felt it, but because they understood its strategic value. He made 2 good points about a supply chain question and 1 observation about the Q4 forecast that was genuinely sharp. When their eyes met across the table, he gave her the same professional nod he always gave her. She gave it back. After the meeting, she spent 30 minutes at her desk staring at a contract she wasn't reading, and then she called Eleanor Marsh. I need to see you, she said, not at the office. Eleanor, who was 71 and had been on the Crosstech board since the company had 12 employees and operated out of a converted warehouse in Lawrenceville, did not ask why. She said, My house, 6 o'clock. I'll make soup. Eleanor Marsh lived in a craftsman bungalow in Shadyside that was exactly as warm and specifically cluttered as Vivian had always found it. Books stacked in places books didn't belong, 3 different reading glasses on 3 different surfaces, a dog named something in Welsh that Vivian couldn't pronounce sleeping in the exact center of the hallway. Eleanor made soup that was actually soup, not the performed minimalism of a person who wanted to appear like someone who made soup. It had bones in the broth and 3 kinds of root vegetables, and the kitchen smelled like something that had been cooking for hours. Vivian sat at the kitchen table and laid out what she knew. Eleanor listened without interrupting. She ate her soup while she listened, which Vivian had always appreciated, the way the older woman treated serious information as something you absorbed rather than reacted to in real time. When Vivian finished, Eleanor set her spoon down. Damian Cole, she said. Not a question, not surprise exactly, something more complicated. The sound of a suspicion you had filed and then refused to act on coming back around to collect its toll. You had doubts, Vivian said. I had a feeling, years ago, about the patents. Eleanor looked at her bowl. Leonard told me the architecture had been developed internally by a team. I asked for the names and the documentation. Damien managed that request. What came back was thorough and organized and told me nothing I could use to push further without accusing someone of something I couldn't prove. She paused. I let it go. I shouldn't have. You didn't have what I have. No, but I knew something was off, and I let the organization of it convince me otherwise. Eleanor looked up. That's on me. I need to know where you stand. If I bring this to the full board, you'll have me. And Robert, maybe Chen, though he's cautious. Eleanor's jaw set. Not Walsh. Walsh owes Damien too many lunches. A 3 is enough to call an emergency session. Is Jackson Reed willing to come in? Vivian looked at her. You remember him. I remember everyone who ever did work that mattered. Eleanor picked up her spoon again. I also remember that he left under circumstances that nobody explained adequately and that Leonard was not himself for quite some time afterward. She looked at Vivian. What does he want out of this? Nothing unreasonable? The foundation restored, transparency going forward? Vivian paused. He turned down money when I mentioned the patents. Did he? He didn't even let me finish the sentence. Eleanor looked at the dog, which had migrated from the hallway to the kitchen doorway, and was now watching them with the patient attention of an animal that had learned conversations were often followed by dropped food. That's either a man of principle, Eleanor said, or a man who doesn't trust that money from us means anything yet. Probably both. No, probably both, Vivian agreed. She drove home at 8:30, ate something she didn't taste, and had just opened her laptop when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Ms. Cross. The voice was male, young, deliberately flattened, the kind of neutral that was itself a performance. I'm calling on behalf of someone who believes you've been making inquiries that could be damaging to your company's interests. He'd like to meet. The word he did not need elaboration. Tell whoever sent you, Vivian said, that I run Crosstech Industries and I make inquiries whenever I judge them to be appropriate. That's the job. She ended the call. Then she sat very still in the quiet of her apartment for a while. The call meant Damien knew she was moving. It meant the window Jackson had described, already short, had gotten shorter. And it meant that whatever Damien had planned as a defense, he was close enough to deploying it that he had decided a warning was more efficient than waiting. She called Jackson. He picked up on the second ring. He knows I'm looking, she said. A pause. She could hear the ambient sounds of the workshop in the background. The space heater, something metal settling. How long do you need to organize what's in the safe? She asked. I've been working on it since this afternoon, he said. Give me 2 more days. You have one. Another pause. Then I'll need coffee. I'll bring it in the morning. She showed up at 7 with 2 coffees from the place on Penn Avenue that didn't open until 6:45 and that she had waited outside for 5 minutes in the November cold because she had arrived early. She set one on the workbench without comment. He took it without comment. They worked. She had brought her laptop and 3 external drives. He had already begun scanning the composition notebooks, careful, page by page. Using a document scanner he had apparently owned and stored in a cabinet without her knowing he had it. The images were clear and time-stamped by the scanner's internal clock, which preserved the metadata. She uploaded them to a cloud account she had created that morning on a personal email address that had nothing to do with Crosstech. Walk me through the architecture, she said, looking at a page from the 3rd notebook. The handwriting was dense, the diagrams precise, the margin notes switching between equations and plain language explanations. Why? Because if I'm presenting this, I need to understand it well enough to explain it. Not at an engineering level, at a board level. He looked at her from the other side of the workbench. You're going to present this yourself? Who else would? He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the notebook toward him and turned it so she could see the diagram he had drawn on the page. A flowchart of sorts, though not a standard one. It had the quality of something drawn by someone who was thinking on the page rather than documenting a finished thought. The problem with processing architecture in 2012, he said, was that efficiency and adaptability were treated as a trade-off. You could build a system that was fast, or you could build one that learned from new inputs. Not both. He tapped the diagram. This is the framework I developed to eliminate that trade-off. The core insight was, and this is what the patents describe, that the architecture itself could be dynamic. The structure could adjust to the type of data it was processing in real time without losing speed. That's what cross-text technology is based on. That's what cross-text technology is based on. Every product, every licensing deal, the whole thing runs on this. He closed the notebook. I spent 14 months building it. I have the working files. I have every version. I have the correspondence with Danny Cha and Marcus Teal. They were the engineers who tested it with me, who can confirm the timeline, if anyone can find them. I'm already trying, she said. My investigator made contact with Marcus Teal yesterday. He's in Singapore. He's willing to provide a sworn statement. Something crossed Jackson's face. Complicated. You move fast. I'm trying to. How'd you find him? He never actually disappeared. He just stopped using his professional name. His middle name is his mother's maiden name. He practices engineering consulting in Singapore under that. She paused. He's been waiting for someone to ask. Jackson was quiet for a long time. He signed an NDA when he left, he said finally. NDAs don't protect fraud. He didn't know it was fraud, not for certain. He looked at the notebook. None of us knew for certain. We just knew something felt wrong and nobody had the specific kind of energy required to fight about it. Because Renata was dying, and Danny had just had his first kid, and Marcus had a visa situation. Damien knew all of that. He knew all of it when he structured the exit packages. The way he said that, flat, no performance of anger, was worse than if he'd raised his voice. It was the tone of someone who had understood something terrible long enough that the terrible part had worn smooth. He picked the moment, Vivian said. Yeah. She looked at the scanner, still running through pages of the fourth notebook. He's going to move against you. Now that he knows I'm investigating, he'll understand that you're involved. He'll try to get ahead of it. I know. Which means he's going to put something out about you publicly before we can establish the record. She looked at him. I need you to be ready for that. What's he going to say? I don't know specifically, but he has a pattern. When he's threatened, he controls the story. He'll find something real, or he'll manufacture something plausible, and he'll put it somewhere it can spread before you have context to push back. She paused. Is there anything he could use? Jackson looked at her steadily. Like what? I don't know. I'm asking you because I need to know what's coming. He was quiet for a moment. My wife's medical costs left us with significant debt. I liquidated everything I had access to at the time. Some of those decisions don't look great on paper if you don't know the context. Anything else? I was named in a civil filing 4 years ago. A client claimed I had damaged a piece of equipment during a restoration. The case was dropped. Who was the client? He said the name. She looked it up on her phone. Then she looked up again. That company is a subsidiary of a holding group that Damien has a partial stake in. The workshop was very quiet. He's been building a file on me, Jackson said. He's been building a file on you. She set the phone down. He's thorough. So are we. She looked at him. The certainty in it, the lack of theater. He was not a man who said things to sound strong. He said things when they were true. So are we, she agreed. The story broke 2 days later. She was at her desk at 7:40 when her communications director called. And by the time she had finished that call, there were already 47 messages in her work inbox, and her phone was ringing on a loop. She silenced it and read. A financial news site had published a piece, sourced to multiple people familiar with the matter, claiming that Jackson Reed, identified as a former Crosstech contractor, had been under investigation for falsifying engineering credentials in 2013 and that Crosstech's legal team had been quietly assessing its exposure related to his claimed contributions to proprietary technology. The piece was careful. It didn't say anything that was technically impossible to walk back. It was written with exactly enough ambiguity to be republished and amplified without triggering defamation liability while doing maximum damage. By 9 o'clock, it had been picked up by 3 other publications. By 10 o'clock, 2 board members had texted her asking for a briefing. By 10:30, Damien had appeared in her office doorway. "Have you seen the coverage?" he said. His voice was exactly as it always was. This was the thing she had to keep reminding herself. He was very good. He had been good at this for years. "I've seen it," she said. "I want you to know I had nothing to do with it." He sat down across from her without being invited. "But I think this changes the calculus on some of the questions you've been asking. If this person has been misrepresenting his history..." "I'm not going to discuss ongoing matters with you right now, Damien." She kept her voice level. "I need to manage the board response. We can talk later." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a recalculation, quick. He was checking her reaction against whatever he had predicted her reaction would be and adjusting. "Of course," he said. He stood. "I'm here if you need me." The moment the door closed, she was on her phone. "They ran the story," she said when Jackson picked up. "I know. Gerald showed me." A pause. "Miles hasn't seen it." "Keep it that way for now. How are you?" "I've been worse." He said it with no particular emphasis, which somehow made it worse. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet. Stay off social. Don't talk to any press. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Thursday." "You have enough?" "I will by Thursday." She paused. "Jackson, I know what this looks like from where you're standing. Your name is out there connected to something false, and I'm asking you to sit still while it spreads." "I've sat still before." "This is different. This time I'm asking you to trust someone instead of just enduring it alone." A long pause. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday." She spent the next 6 hours working. Marcus Teal's sworn statement came through her investigator at noon, 14 pages of specific technical testimony with attached documentation. At 2, a forensic accountant she had retained privately sent her a preliminary report on the foundation accounts, the shell companies, the flow of funds, the specific invoices that did not correspond to real vendors. At 4, her IT contact, a woman named Sandra, who had worked security for Crosstech for 11 years, and who Vivian trusted with a completeness she couldn't fully explain, confirmed that the access logs for the archive facility showed 2 entries from Damien's credentials the week before the fire. She called Eleanor. "We have enough," she said. "Then let's do it," Eleanor said. She sent the emergency board notification at 4:45. She cited a material financial disclosure issue. The meeting was set for Thursday morning, 9 o'clock. Required attendance for all directors. At 5:30, walking to her car in the parking structure below the building, she heard footsteps behind her that were not casual. She turned. Damien Cole was standing 10 feet away. He was in his coat, his legal pad tucked under his arm, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. The performance was still there, but something had slipped behind it, just slightly, just enough. "You called a board meeting," he said. "I did." "Without consulting me." "I consult the board, Damien. You're the COO. I've built this company alongside you for 3 years. His voice had changed fractionally, still controlled, but tighter. "I've been here through every hard quarter, every board challenge, I know your contributions." She held his gaze. "The board meeting will be a standard disclosure process. You'll have your opportunity to present." "Vivian." He said her name in a specific way, a reminder of proximity, of years, of all the weight that implied. "Whatever you think you've found, whatever Reed has told you, you need to be careful. He has reasons to want to damage this company. He has reasons to want to damage me." "What reasons would those be?" He paused, just briefly. He walked away from something valuable, and he spent 10 years resenting it. She said. She pulled her keys out of her coat pocket. "I'll see you Thursday, Damien." She turned her back on him and walked to her car. She was in the parking structure for another 30 seconds while she unlocked the door and got in. And in those 30 seconds, she was aware of exactly where he was standing and kept her breathing steady because the adrenaline was a real thing. She had to work around, and she had learned early that the worst time to betray something was when you thought you were already safe. She pulled out of the parking structure and drove 4 blocks before she pulled over and sat for a minute. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not fear exactly. The aftermath of sustained composure, the way your body collected the debt after the performance ended. She drove to Jackson's workshop. She hadn't planned to. She was there before she had finished deciding to go. The rain had started somewhere during the drive, the heavy, cold kind that fell straight down and meant it. Pittsburgh in November was capable of this specific grimness, and tonight it was delivering fully. She parked on the street and ran the half block to the workshop door. She knocked. It opened. He looked at her. Her coat dark with rain, her hair out of its usual arrangement, whatever she was carrying in her face that she hadn't managed to put away in the car. He didn't say anything. He stepped back from the door. She came in. He closed it behind her. The space heater was going, and the workshop was warm in the way of places that were used, lived in, if not slept in. She stood in the middle of the floor for a moment. She was not a person who said things before she was ready to say them, but there was something tonight that was sitting right at the edge of ready. He confronted me in the parking structure, she said. What did he say? She relayed it. He listened. He's scared, Jackson said. I know. Scared people make bad decisions. Also dangerous ones. Also that. She pushed her wet hair back from her face. It was an unguarded gesture, the kind she didn't make in the office. She noticed and didn't bother to correct it. I keep running the scenario where we show up Thursday and it's not enough. Where he's managed the board better than we think. Where the documentation isn't sufficient and he turns it around, that's not going to happen. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know what's in that safe. I know what Marcus Teal's statement covers. And I know that the one advantage we have is that everything we're bringing is real. He paused. Manufactured stories fall apart when the details get specific. Real ones hold. She looked at him. He was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, and he looked tired. The specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying something quietly for a long time and had finally picked it up in public, but not uncertain, not even close to uncertain. How are you this calm? She said. He thought about it for a moment. Because I've already been through the worst version of this. Renata died. Everything else after that. He stopped. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. It matters. But I've already been through a thing that can't be fixed, and this one can be. He met her eyes. That changes how scared I am. She held that. She thought about what it cost to say something like that out loud. I'm sorry I talked to you the way I did at the gala, she said. I know I said it at the workshop. I'm saying it again here because, she paused, because I think I needed to say it somewhere I wasn't still managing something. He looked at her for a long moment. You were doing your job, he said. No, I wasn't. I was being careless. There's a difference. He didn't argue with that. He just nodded, very slightly, which she was beginning to understand was as much agreement as he usually gave. Outside, the rain hit the workshop windows in uneven waves. Miles was at a friend's house for the night. She knew that because she had asked, because she had needed to know who was where. The workshop was quiet except for the heater and the rain, and the low mechanical sound of the scanner still running in the corner, still working through the last of the composition notebooks. What do you think happens after Thursday? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Depends how it goes. Assuming it goes the way we need it to. Then the company has to figure out what it owes and how to make it right. He shifted his weight, and I go back to fixing things. Different than what I was fixing before, maybe. But that's what I do. You don't want to come back? Not the way I left. She understood that. She thought she understood exactly what it meant. Not a refusal, but a condition. The insistence that return had to mean something different than the version of entry that had never been offered to him in the first place. Fair, she said. She stayed another half hour. They went over the final organization of the documentation together. What would be presented first? What would be held in reserve? The order of disclosure that would be hardest to interrupt. He made a change to her presentation sequence that was better than what she had planned, and she told him so. And he accepted it without false modesty or unnecessary comment. She left at 9. Standing outside the workshop in the rain, she looked back once through the window. He was already back at the workbench, head down. Working. She thought about what he had said. I've already been through the worst version of this. And the particular kind of courage that was not the absence of fear, but the presence of something larger. Something you had earned through the worst thing and kept. She walked to her car. Thursday was 36 hours away. Thursday came in gray and cold, the kind of Pittsburgh morning that made the city look like it had been photographed through smoked glass. Vivian was up at 5. She made coffee, stood at her kitchen window, and watched the street below settle into its early routines. A delivery truck, a man walking a dog, a woman in scrubs moving fast toward the bus stop. She had slept 3 hours. She knew because she had watched the clock through the other 5, running scenarios she had already run a dozen times, finding the same endpoints, coming back to the beginning. The documentation was solid. The sequence was right. Marcus Teal's statement covered what it needed to cover. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The part you couldn't prepare for was the room. Boardrooms had their own physics. 12 people around a table changed the weight of information, compressed some things, expanded others, created pressures that had nothing to do with what was true and everything to do with who believed what about whom and why. She had run enough board meetings to know that the most comprehensive case in the world could lose ground to a single well-timed question from the wrong person, and the thinnest defense could hold if the defender understood the room better than the accuser. Damien understood rooms. She poured the rest of her coffee down the drain, got dressed, and drove to the office. She had asked Jackson to arrive at 8:45. The meeting started at 9. She wanted him in the building before Damien knew he was there. He was standing in the lobby when she came through the main doors at 8:30, wearing the same dark jacket he'd had on the night of the gala. It fit him slightly better today, or maybe she was just seeing it differently. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder. He looked like a man who had been awake for a while and had made his peace with it. "How's Miles?" she asked. "At school, Gerald's picking him up." He looked around the lobby. The Crosstech headquarters was 12 floors of glass and steel that had been built 7 years ago on the strength of the technology Jackson had developed in a rented office in San Francisco. He had never been inside this building. "Nice place," he said in a tone that communicated something more specific than appreciation. "I know," she said. "Come on." She took him up the back elevator, the one that bypassed the main floor. Sandra was waiting on the 10th floor with the document packages, printed copies of everything organized in the sequence they had agreed on, labeled with numbered tabs. Sandra handed them over without ceremony, gave Jackson a look that held something complicated she didn't explain, and went back to the security station. Vivian set the packages on the conference table in the small room adjacent to the boardroom, the room where speakers waited, where people composed themselves before walking into something large. "He'll see you when you come in," she said. "He won't show it, but he'll know what it means immediately." "Good." "The board will have questions. Some of them will be adversarial. Walsh especially. He'll try to undermine the documentation's chain of custody." "Then we address chain of custody first." "That's what I planned." She looked at him. "When I introduce you, I'm going to be direct about who you are and what you built. I'm not going to frame it gently, if that's uncomfortable." "I've been uncomfortable before," he said. She nodded. She looked at the document packages on the table. He looked at them too. There was a specific silence between two people who have done the preparation and are now standing at the edge of the thing the preparation was for. "Whatever happens in there," he said, not looking at her, "you should know that you're not what I expected." She looked at him. "I thought you'd be, I don't know, more like the version of you I met the first night." He paused. "You're not." She didn't know what to do with that exactly. She filed it in the same place she had filed the other things from the past week that didn't have obvious categories. "Let's go," she said. The boardroom was full. 9 directors. Damien Cole at the far end of the table, the yellow legal pad in front of him. Leonard in the chair along the wall, reserved for non-voting attendees, which he had insisted on, which Vivian had tried to talk him out of and failed. 2 company attorneys, hers and the general counsel, who owed his position to Damien and who she watched carefully as she entered. She entered first. She set her materials at the head of the table. She greeted the board members by name, each one, briefly. When she reached Walsh, he gave her the particular smile of a man who believed he knew something she didn't. Then Jackson walked in. She watched Damien's face. He was good. He was very good. But there are moments when the thing you have built your security around for years walks into a room in physical form, and even the best trained composure has a half-second gap before the recovery. It was a very small gap. She would not have caught it 3 weeks ago. She caught it now. Damien looked at Jackson for exactly that half second, a stillness that was different from the stillness around it. And then he looked at his legal pad and made a note on it, which was a thing people did when they needed something to do with their hands. Leonard, from his chair against the wall, looked at Jackson and gave him a small nod. Jackson returned it. Eleanor Marsh said, "Good morning, Mr. Reed," simply like it was the most natural thing. "Good morning," Jackson said. He took the chair beside Vivian's. She called the meeting to order. "I've called this emergency session under Provision 12 of the company charter," she said, "which covers material financial and legal disclosures that require full board attention prior to any external communication. I want to be clear from the start that what I'm presenting today is supported by documentation, sworn testimony, and forensic financial analysis. I am asking for your full attention, and I'm asking you to hold your questions until I've completed the initial presentation. After that, I will take questions in whatever order and for as long as necessary." She paused. The room was the specific quiet of people who understood that something significant was happening. "Crosstech Industries was built on a technological foundation," she said. "That foundation, the adaptive processing architecture that underlies every major product and licensing agreement this company has, was designed, developed, and documented by Jackson Reed between 2010 and 2013, while he was working as a contracted developer for what was then a small startup that Leonard Cross subsequently acquired." She looked at the board. "Mr. Reed's name does not appear on the patents connected to that technology. The patents, filed in 2014 and 2015, credit 3 other names, 2 of whom have since left the company, and 1 of whom, as I will demonstrate, participated in the filing process under circumstances that constitute fraud." Walsh shifted in his chair. "This is an extraordinary—" "I asked for questions to be held," Vivian said. "Level, not loud. I'll come back to you." She laid out the case the way she had organized it in the workshop, chronological, evidence-led, each claim followed immediately by the supporting document. The early engineering notebooks, authenticated by metadata and cross-referenced with the dated test files on the USB drives. The working file versions, 7 of them, spanning 14 months, that showed the architecture developing from initial concept to final implementation in Jackson's handwriting and under his file authorship. Marcus Teal's sworn statement, 14 pages covering his direct participation in testing the architecture alongside Jackson. The timeline discrepancy between when Jackson left the company and when the patents were filed, a gap of 7 months during which the filing names had been changed on documentation that no longer existed in the company archive, because it had burned. She placed the archive access logs on the table. These logs show 2 entries from the COO's executive credentials at the archive facility, she said. The first was 8 days before the fire. The second was the night of the Crosstech annual gala. The same night that my grandfather invited Mr. Reed to attend, the same night that my grandfather informed me of Mr. Reed's role in creating our core technology. The room was very still. She looked at Damien Cole directly. He was looking at the access logs. He was still making that choice, the one between managing the room and processing what was on the table, and she watched him choose the room. "I want to address this directly," he said, "because what's being implied is serious and it deserves a serious response." His voice was composed, patient. She had always been impressed by his composure. Today it made her tired. "I visited the archive facility the week before the fire as part of a routine records management review. My credentials being in the log is entirely consistent with my responsibilities. The suggestion that I had anything to do with the fire is, I haven't suggested that yet," Vivian said. "I was still on the archive logs." A small silence. "We'll come back to the fire," she said. She moved to the foundation accounts. She watched the board's faces change as she walked them through the numbers. Some of them had known the Renata Reed Foundation existed in the way that people know about institutional charity arms, as a line item, as a good faith gesture, not as something they had examined closely. Now they looked at the shell companies, the invoiced vendors, the administrative expenses that led to accounts in jurisdictions that were not Pittsburgh and were not Crosstech and were not anything that could be explained by legitimate operations. $2,700,000. Walsh said, quietly, Jesus. She let that sit for a moment. Then she placed the final document on the table, the forensic accountant's report, which had taken 3 days and which laid the money trail in terms specific enough that it could survive a legal challenge. The foundation was established in memory of Renata Reed, Vivian said. She died in 2014. She was 30 years old. The foundation was created to support families affected by the disease that took her life. She paused. The funds were redirected within 18 months of the foundation's establishment, and the redirection continued for 6 years. She sat down. The room held the specific weight of people who are processing the gap between what they believed was true and what is being demonstrated in front of them. Eleanor Marsh's face was unreadable in the way of someone who is being careful not to influence the room before it has processed. Robert Fenn was looking at the forensic report. Chen, the cautious one, was looking at Jackson. Jackson was looking at the table. His jaw was set. He had read all of this before, had been the one to compile much of it, but there was something different about having it read in a room like this, in a building built on what he had made, in front of the people who had benefited from it for a decade. She watched him absorb that difference and hold it without letting it move his face. Damian Cole set his pen down on the legal pad. "I'd like to respond," he said. "Go ahead," Vivian said. He looked around the table. He was very good. Even now, even sitting across from what she had just laid out, he was constructing a version of the room that worked for him. "What you've seen this morning is a presentation designed to tell a particular story," he said. "The engineering documentation is 10 years old, and its provenance is, I'm sorry to say this, entirely unverifiable outside the word of the man sitting next to our CEO. A man," he added, with a precision she could only call surgical, "who has had every reason for a decade to claim credit for work that was collaborative and that he contributed to but did not originate alone." "The USB metadata," Vivian started, "can be altered," he said. "That's not a statement of fact about these specific files. It's a statement of digital forensics that any competent attorney will raise." He looked at the board. "I'm not saying Mr. Reed is lying. I'm saying that what we have here is a dispute about attribution that is years old and that deserves a proper legal and forensic review, not an emergency board meeting that has been assembled in 36 hours based on materials prepared by one party." He paused, looked at Vivian. "And I'd be failing in my responsibility to this board if I didn't say that the timing of this presentation, days after a media story about Mr. Reed's background, days after our CEO was observed making inquiries into areas outside her primary operating authority, raises questions about what's driving this, and whether those questions should include the CEO's own judgment." The air in the room changed slightly. Walsh looked up. Chen looked at Walsh. Vivian kept her eyes on Damian. She had expected this. She had specifically prepared for this version of it because she knew him, and she knew that his best play was to make the board uncertain rather than convinced, to make them feel that the safer institutional choice was to pause, review, appoint a committee. The organizational equivalent of doing nothing while giving it a procedural name. She had one thing left. She looked at Jackson. He reached into the canvas bag. He placed on the table a single envelope, the larger of the 2 sealed envelopes from the safe. He opened it. Inside was a document, 2 pages, dated July 2013, bearing 2 signatures and a notary stamp. "This is a co-development agreement," Jackson said. It was the first time he had spoken in the meeting, and the room adjusted to his voice, lower than Damian's, less polished, carrying nothing it hadn't earned. It was drawn up by a patent attorney named Carol Schenk, who is still in practice in San Francisco. It establishes my sole authorship of the core adaptive processing architecture and my agreement to license it to Crosstech's predecessor company under specific terms. One of the 2 signatures on this document belongs to Damian Cole. He slid the document to the center of the table. "He signed as a witness," Jackson said. "In the capacity of operations manager, he was in that room. He knew exactly what was being licensed and who had built it." He paused. "He signed his name to a document that says I built it, and then he spent the following year making sure the patent said someone else did." The room was completely silent. Damian looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. Walsh, who had been Damien's ally in the room and who Vivian had written off, said in a strange, flat voice, "Damien, is that your signature?" Damien said nothing. "Damien." Walsh's voice was different now. Something in it had shifted. The anger of a man who has been made to look foolish, which was its own category of dangerous. "Answer the question." "I'll need to consult with my attorney before the—" "That's your answer?" Walsh set both hands flat on the table. "After 15 years? That's your answer?" The boardroom door opened. Two men in dark coats, federal credentials in hand, stood in the doorway. They were accompanied by Sandra from security, who had known exactly what was happening and who had let them in at the arranged time. Vivian had made that call 3 days ago, had spent 3 hours on the phone with a federal financial crimes unit explaining what she had and what she needed, and the answer had been that they were very interested and they would be there on Thursday. They were there on Thursday. One of the agents said Damien Cole's name and the specific language that came with credentials, the legal terms that meant it was over. Damien Cole sat very still for exactly 4 seconds. Then something left his face. Not composure, something under the composure. The version of himself that he had been maintaining so precisely and for so long that Vivian doubted he could have told you anymore, where the performance ended and the person began. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his legal pad and then he set it back down because where he was going there was no use for it. One of the agents said something brief and professional. Damien said nothing. He moved toward the door with the specific stiffness of a man whose body understood before his mind had finished processing. He passed Jackson's chair. He did not look at Jackson. Jackson did not look at him. The door closed. The room sat with what had just happened. Leonard Cross, from his chair against the wall, let out a breath that was long and slow and that seemed to carry weight he had been holding for years. He looked at his hands. He looked at Jackson. He didn't say anything, and neither did Jackson, and somehow that said more than anything either of them could have put into words. Eleanor Marsh was the first board member to speak. "I want to move," she said, in the precise, measured voice of a woman who had been in institutions long enough to know that what came after catastrophe was procedure, and that procedure was what prevented the catastrophe from compounding. "I want to move that this board formally acknowledge the validity of the documentation presented this morning and that we commission an immediate independent review of patent filings, foundation accounts, and all financial instruments associated with Damien Cole's tenure as COO, with findings to be reported to the full board within 30 days. "Seconded," said Robert Fenn. They voted. 8 in favor. Walsh, after a long pause that Vivian watched without expression, raised his hand. 9 in favor. The motion passed. "I also want to move," Eleanor said, looking at Vivian, "that the board formally reaffirm the position and authority of our CEO, whose conduct in bringing this matter forward demonstrated the exact standard of integrity that this board should expect and that this company requires." That motion took less time. Vivian accepted it without ceremony. She thanked the board. She gave them the contact information for the forensic accountant and the federal unit. She told them that her communications team would prepare an external statement, that she wanted to review it before it went out, and that she would have draft language to Eleanor within 24 hours. She kept her voice steady throughout. When the room began to empty, she sat for a moment. Jackson was still in the chair beside hers. The document, the co-development agreement with Damien's witness signature, was still on the table between them. "You didn't tell me about that one," she said. "You didn't ask. I asked if you had documentation. You asked if I had records from the safe." He looked at the document. "That one wasn't in the safe. I've been carrying it in my jacket for 6 years. She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I always thought, if I ever needed to prove something to someone who mattered, that would be the one that did it." He picked it up, looked at it. The paper was soft at the folds from years of being carried. "I didn't know who that person would be, or when." He placed it back on the table between them. Leonard Cross crossed the room slowly and lowered himself into the chair on Jackson's other side. He looked like a man who had been allowed, finally, to set something very heavy down. He wasn't entirely sure his legs worked the same way anymore. I owe you more than I can say, Leonard said. You don't owe me a speech, Jackson said. Not harshly, just directly. No, I don't suppose I do. Leonard looked at the document, at the signatures. She would have hated what was done in her name. Renata, she didn't tolerate dishonesty, not from anyone. I know, Jackson said quietly. She'd have been very proud of what you did here. Jackson didn't answer. He looked at the wall. The muscles in his jaw moved slightly. He let it pass. The room was almost empty now. Vivian gathered the document packages. Her hands were not shaking. She noted that with a kind of distant satisfaction. The press statement, she said, looking at Jackson. I want your input before we release it, on the language around your role. Keep my son's name out of it. Already done. Then I trust your judgment. She looked at him. Those words from him, she was beginning to understand, were not a small thing. She picked up the co-development agreement and held it out. He took it back, folded it along the same worn lines, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. She watched him do that. She thought about 6 years. She thought about carrying something in a jacket pocket, through Pittsburgh winters and workshop days and school pickups, because you believed that eventually the moment would come when it mattered and you needed to be ready. That particular kind of patience, not passive, not resigned, but simply steady, was not something she had a natural talent for. She was aware of that. She was aware that it was something you had to learn from circumstances that were ungentle about the teaching. What do you do now? She asked. He stood up, straightened his jacket. Pick up my kid, he said. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Vivian? He said without turning around. She looked up. You did good today. He paused. Not just today. He went out. She sat in the empty boardroom for another minute, alone with the document packages and the long table and the city visible through the windows, gray and cold and entirely itself, the way Pittsburgh always was on the mornings that mattered. Then she picked up her phone and got to work. The press statement went out at 6 o'clock Thursday evening. Vivian had written 4 drafts. The first was too defensive. The second overcorrected into language that was so carefully neutral it said nothing. The third was close but read, in the third paragraph, like a company protecting itself rather than a company telling the truth. The fourth she sent to Eleanor at 4:30, got back 2 line edits and an approval at 5:15, and released at 6 with her name on it. It named Jackson Reed as the original architect of Crosstech's core technology. It described the company's commitment to correcting the public record. It confirmed that federal investigators were examining financial irregularities connected to the Renata Reed Foundation and that the company was cooperating fully. It did not use the word fraud, that was the attorney's insistence, but it used enough other words in enough proximity that any reader would arrive at the same place without being led there by the hand. It did not mention Miles Reed. It did not mention Renata's illness. It did not make Jackson's private grief into a corporate narrative. She had been specific about that. Nobody had pushed back. By 8 o'clock, the story had been picked up nationally. By 9, the financial news sites that had run Damien's planted piece about Jackson 3 days earlier were running corrections with varying degrees of editorial discomfort. By 10, the Crosstech stock price had done the things stock prices do when a company removes a source of concealed liability, dropped slightly, then recovered, then settled at a number that reflected something closer to actual reality than the inflated confidence of the previous week. Vivian sat in her apartment with a glass of water she wasn't drinking and watched the coverage scroll past on her laptop. At 10:30, she closed the laptop and went to bed. She slept 7 hours, which was more than she had expected. Jackson saw the statement on Gerald's phone at 6:15, standing in the alley behind the workshop while Miles finished the last of his homework at the kitchen table inside. He read it twice. Gerald stood beside him, reading over his shoulder in the unapologetic way Gerald did most things. "That's good," Gerald said. "That's real good." Jackson handed the phone back. "Yeah," he said. He stood in the alley for another minute. The evening was cold but not brutal, the sky above the Strip District doing the particular thing Pittsburgh skies did in November. Low clouds reflecting orange and amber from the city below, the river invisible but present, something in the air that was specific to this particular place and no other. He went inside. Miles was at the table with a math worksheet that had 3 problems left on it. He looked up when his father came in, read something in his face the way he always did. That particular steadiness his son had developed, the accuracy of a kid who had learned early to pay close attention to the adults around him, because the adults around him had mattered in ways that required monitoring. "You okay?" Miles asked. "I'm good. You look like something happened." "Something did happen. I'll tell you about it when you're done with your homework." Miles looked at the worksheet, looked at his father, made the calculation. "What if I told you I only have 1 problem left?" "I would count the problems on the worksheet." Miles sighed and picked up his pencil. Jackson made dinner. It was not a great dinner. Pasta with a jar sauce he had improved slightly with things from the refrigerator, the kind of meal that was honest about what it was. They ate at the kitchen table, which was also the homework table, which was also the place where they had most of the conversations that mattered. Jackson told Miles the version of the story that was appropriate for an 8-year-old. He told him that a long time ago, before Miles was born, his father had built something important, that someone had taken credit for it when they shouldn't have. That this week, some people had helped make it right. Miles ate his pasta and listened with the focused attention he brought to things that seemed important to the people he loved. "Did you build a machine?" Miles asked. "A different kind, a system, like the logic inside a computer, but bigger." Miles thought about this. "Is it like the stuff in the workshop?" "It's more like, you know how the linotype press has a logic to it? The way the parts work together has a reason, and if you understand the reason, you can fix it." "Yeah, it's like that, but for information instead of metal." Miles chewed, considered. "So it's invisible machinery." Jackson looked at his son. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what it is." Miles accepted this with the equanimity of a kid who had grown up in a workshop and found machinery, visible or otherwise, to be a reasonable thing for people to build. "Did the person who took credit get in trouble?" he asked. "He did." "Good." No drama, just verdict. He went back to his pasta. Then, "Dad." "Yeah." "Why didn't you fight for it before?" The question landed the way Miles's questions sometimes did, quietly, without fanfare, in exactly the spot that had no easy answer. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Because your mom got sick, and then she died. And for a while after that, I didn't have a lot of fight left for anything that wasn't keeping us going." Miles looked at his plate. He did this sometimes with things that were large. Looked away from them, let them exist in the room without looking directly at them. "But you did it now," he said. "I did it now." Miles nodded. "That's still good," he said, "even if it took a long time." Jackson looked at his son. 8 years old, one arm developing the habit of hanging off the side of the chair, pasta sauce on his chin, his mother's eyes steady and dark and already wiser than they should have needed to be. "Yeah," Jackson said, "it's still good." The weeks that followed were not simple. The federal investigation moved at the pace of federal investigations, methodical, procedurally thorough, indifferent to the urgency of anyone waiting for resolution. Damian Cole retained attorneys. There were hearings, depositions, the specific bureaucratic machinery of consequence grinding through its process. Jackson gave a deposition in a downtown office building on a Tuesday morning that lasted 4 hours and that left him sitting in his truck in the parking garage afterward, hands on the wheel, not quite ready to move. He wasn't asked to do anything else after that. The machine ran without him. He went back to the linotype. The board's independent review completed in 28 days. The forensic accountant's final report was 312 pages. Vivian read all of it. She sent Jackson a summary, not because he asked for it, but because she thought he deserved to know. The full picture of what Damian had taken, rerouted, obscured, and spent over 7 years was, in her one-line summary at the end of the email, worse than the preliminary numbers indicated. The foundation recovery took another 30 days after that. The shell companies were unwound, the offshore accounts were identified and frozen. The recovered funds, $2,700,000 plus interest calculated through the investigation period, were returned to the foundation's legitimate accounts. Vivian called Jackson when the transfer was confirmed. "It's back," she said. He was in the workshop. She could hear the space heater. "All of it?" "All of it, plus some." A pause. "Good," he said. "Just that." But she could hear what was in it. "The board wants to discuss the patent acknowledgement formally," she said. "There's a meeting scheduled for—" "I know, I'll be there. And they're going to put a compensation proposal on the table. I'm telling you ahead of time so you're not caught off guard." "Vivian, I know what you've said. I'm not arguing with you. I'm just telling you so you can have your answer ready and we don't spend 40 minutes on it." A short silence that might have been amusement. "How much are they proposing?" She told him. The silence was longer this time. "That's a lot of money," he said. "It's what they owe you." "It's more than what they owe me." "The extra is for the years," she said. "For the time. For the—" "Jackson, I'm not going to negotiate this down on their behalf. You built what they're standing on." "I know what I built," he said. "I also know what I need." She had expected this. She had thought about how to respond to it for 3 days, because she knew him well enough by now to know that the refusal wasn't pride and it wasn't performance. It was something more specific than either of those. "Tell me what you need," she said. He told her. The board meeting was a shorter version of the previous one. Same table, fewer documents, a different texture to the room. The confrontation was over. What remained was the architecture of aftermath. Jackson sat at the table again, beside Vivian again. He had worn the same jacket again, which she had decided was not carelessness about appearance, but rather a statement that he was the same person who had been in this room before and intended to leave the same way. He laid out his terms. The Renata Reed Foundation would be restructured with a new independent board and an external audit requirement built into its charter. Its mission, supporting families affected by the disease that had taken Renata, would be expanded and fully funded for a minimum of 10 years through a direct cross-tech endowment. The foundation's name would remain as it was, because it was her name and he wasn't going to change it to something institutional. The patent record would be corrected. Not quietly amended in some footnote, but formally acknowledged in a public statement that Crosstech would release and that would name Jackson Reed as the originating architect of the core technology. He was not asking for a press tour. He was not asking for a profile piece. He was asking for the record to say the true thing. He declined the cash compensation. The room processed this in silence. Eleanor Marsh looked like she wanted to argue. He let her. "It's not a principle," he said when she pushed. "It's a calculation. I have a workshop. I have a kid. I have what I need. Taking money I don't need from a company I no longer trust completely turns this into a transaction, and that's not what I want it to be." "What do you want it to be?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her. "A correction. Just that. A thing that was wrong, made right." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She nodded, once, with the weight of someone who understood the difference. He did accept one thing. Not money, equity. A small percentage of shares structured as a long-term holding with no active role requirements, because his attorney, a woman in Oakland he had called on the advice of Marcus Teal, had told him that accepting zero was legally complicated, and that a clean equity arrangement was the simplest path to a permanent record of acknowledgement. He accepted this because it was practical, and because Jackson Reed, whatever else he was a practical man. The meeting ended. He walked out of Crosstech headquarters into a December afternoon that had turned clean and cold. The sky doing something unusual for Pittsburgh, actually clear, actual blue, the kind of light that made the city look like a different version of itself. He called Gerald. "It's done," he said. "Yeah? Yeah. How do you feel?" He stood on the sidewalk and thought about that. The honest answer was complicated. There was relief, which he had expected. There was something heavier underneath the relief. Not grief exactly, but the specific weight of a thing that had been carried for so long that the absence of it changed your posture, and you had to figure out how to stand again. "I feel like I want to fix the linotype," he said. Gerald laughed. "I'll put the kettle on." The Innovation Center opened in March. It was built on the top floor of Crosstech's headquarters, a research and development space equipped in a way that reflected what research and development actually required rather than what it looked like in architectural renderings. Good light, real workspace, equipment that worked. It bore a name in simple lettering above the entrance, the Renata Reed Innovation Center. Jackson did not attend the press opening. Vivian had not pushed him to. There had been a private opening the evening before. 10 people, champagne he didn't drink, Leonard in a chair that was more comfortable than the standard folding kind because Eleanor had thought to ask for it. Miles had come, wearing a collared shirt that he had complained about for the duration of the car ride, and that he stopped noticing once he discovered there were 3 different types of functioning vintage computers in the exhibit section that he was allowed to touch. Jackson had stood in front of the name above the entrance for a while. He didn't perform anything about it. He just stood there. That was between him and the name and the specific thing it meant to have something permanent attached to her, in a place that was built on what she had believed in when she was alive, that he could build something worth building. Miles had appeared beside him after a while, slightly rumpled, the collar of his shirt wilting, holding a packet of printed information about one of the vintage computers that he clearly intended to keep. "She would have liked this," Miles said. Jackson looked at his son. "She would have said the name lettering was too small," he said. Miles considered this. She would have been right. Yeah. They stood there together for another minute, father and son, in a building built on invisible machinery, in a city that had never fully appreciated either of them and that was in the slow process of being corrected on that point. Then Miles said, "Can we get food? I'm starving." And the moment folded back into the ordinary where it belonged. Vivian started coming to the workshop in April. The stated reason was that she wanted to learn how mechanical restoration worked. The actual reason was more complicated than that, and less complicated than she was making it, which was a thing she recognized and did not immediately address because addressing it required a clarity she was still working toward. She came on Saturday mornings because Saturdays were when Miles was around and Miles had, without being asked, appointed himself the person who explained things to her when his father was in the middle of something and couldn't stop. He explained the linotype with a thoroughness that suggested he had absorbed more from the workshop than he had ever admitted. "The matrices hold the letter molds," Miles told her one Saturday, standing on a step stool so he could see properly into the machine's upper workings. "When you press a key, the right matrix drops down and the molten lead fills it. That's how you get a line of type." "Mace, what's the molten lead temperature?" Miles looked at his father. "Dad, what temperature?" "Around 550 Fahrenheit, Jackson said, without looking up from the gear housing he was cleaning. Miles relayed this to Vivian with the authority of someone who had personally verified it. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. She was not good at it initially. The mechanical intuition that Jackson had and that Miles was developing was not something she had any native version of, and she was the kind of person who found the early stages of incompetence genuinely uncomfortable. She was honest about this, which surprised him. Most people he had known who were very good at their professional lives dealt with beginner incompetence by avoiding the situations that produced it. She showed up and was bad at things and asked questions that were sometimes obvious and occasionally sharp, and she did not pretend to understand things she didn't. "You have no patience for not knowing things," he told her one Saturday, watching her try to thread a replacement roller bearing into a position that required more feel than force. "I have patience for not knowing things. I have no patience for learning slowly." "Those are the same problem." She looked at him. "Is this a lesson?" "No, it's an observation." "Do you want me to stop coming?" He looked at her. She looked at him. The question hung there between them with the particular weight of a question that was not actually about roller bearings. "No," he said. She went back to the roller bearing. Miles was the one who broke the ice that nobody was specifically breaking, because Miles was 8 and then 9 and had inherited from Renata the particular quality of saying the true thing without particular drama. It was a Saturday in May, late afternoon, the workshop catching the low western light through the upper windows the way it did in spring, golden and specific, the dust motes visible in it, the machines casting long shadows. Vivian was at the workbench attempting to clean the ink channels on a small tabletop press that Jackson had acquired from an estate sale in Ohio. Miles was doing homework at the back table and ostensibly not paying attention to either of them. You like her, Miles said. Jackson did not stop what he was doing. Mind your homework. I'm between problems. Do the next one. Miles picked up his pencil, set it down. I'm just saying, it's okay if you do. Vivian was looking at the ink channel with focus that was slightly too concentrated to be entirely about the ink channel. Miles, Jackson said, homework. I'm going. A pause. She comes every Saturday. I know she does. Nobody comes every Saturday for a machine. You come every Saturday for a machine. I live here. Jackson looked up at the ceiling briefly. A man encountering the specific experience of being out-argued by his own child on a subject he was not ready to argue. Vivian was looking at her hands and attempting not to smile, which he could see from where he was standing. The next math problem, Jackson said. Now. Miles went back to his homework with the contained satisfaction of someone who had said what he wanted to say and considered the subject formally opened. The evening of the Innovation Center's grand public opening was in June, the kind of evening that Pittsburgh produced occasionally as if to remind people why they had stayed. Warm, the sky doing something layered and amber above the river, the city looking like a place that had decided to show its best self. The event was a public ceremony. Speeches, a ribbon cutting, photographs. Vivian spoke. She spoke well, which was not a surprise. She acknowledged the people whose work had made the center possible. She acknowledged Jackson by name, and when she said his name, she did not gesture toward him in the crowd or make it into a moment that required him to perform anything. She just said it, the way you said the names of things that were true. He stood near the back with Gerald and Miles, who was wearing the same collared shirt from March, and had grown half an inch since then, which meant it no longer quite reached his wrists. He listened to Vivian speak, and he felt something that was not the clean, simple emotion that stories usually assign to moments like this. It was more tangled than that. There was pride in it. Genuine, specific pride in the thing that had his wife's name on it. There was grief in it, the kind that didn't go away and that he had stopped expecting to. There was something forward-facing in it, too, something without a clean word. The particular sensation of realizing that the future had more shape to it than you had been allowing yourself to notice. Miles leaned against his arm during the speech. Jackson put his hand on his son's shoulder, and Miles didn't shrug it off the way he sometimes did in public now, the beginning of the age where affection from a parent required privacy to be acceptable. He left it there. After the ceremony, after the photographs and the reception and the slow dispersal of the crowd, Vivian found him outside the building on the steps that looked out toward the river. She had changed out of the formal jacket she'd worn for the ceremony and was in something simpler, her hair down in a way he had only seen in the workshop. She looked like a different version of herself. Or maybe the same version without the professional layer. She stood beside him and they looked at the river together. Good speech, he said. It was fine. The third paragraph ran long. Nobody noticed. I noticed. He almost smiled. How are you? She was quiet for a moment, not the composure kind of quiet, just the kind where someone was actually thinking about the question. Tired, she said, in a way that feels different from usual tired, like the kind that comes after something ends, not the kind that comes from doing too much. It's over, he said. Most of it. She looked at the river. Damien's attorneys filed a motion yesterday that my team says is a delay tactic and will not hold. The Foundation's new board met for the first time on Monday. The patent acknowledgement has been formally published. She paused. So, yes, most of it. How's Leonard? Better. He had a follow-up with his cardiologist last week. The numbers improved. She glanced at him. He asks about you. Tell him I'll call. You could visit. I could. She smiled slightly, which was a thing she did more easily now than when he had first known her. It had taken months. It was worth the wait. They stood in the warm June evening without speaking for a while, and the silence between them was the kind that had been built slowly, through Saturdays and workshop conversations and the specific intimacy of two people learning something difficult together. It was not a silence that needed to be filled. I've been thinking about something, she said. Okay. I have a board dinner every second Thursday. It's exactly as tedious as it sounds. I've been going alone for 3 years. She looked at the river. I thought maybe you'd want to come to one. At some point, if you wanted. He turned to look at her. She was still looking at the river, which meant she was doing the things she did when she was less certain than she intended to appear, directing her attention at something that wasn't the conversation. Like a thing, he said. Like a thing. Yes. I don't like board dinners. Nobody likes board dinners. I don't own a suit. Gerald has a tuxedo. He looked at the river too, the amber light on the water, the familiar skyline, the city that had given him anonymity when he needed it and was now, slowly, asking him back into visibility. What changed? He asked. She turned to look at him. What do you mean? When you met me, you saw someone who didn't belong in the room. That doesn't just go away because of what happened. She held his gaze. This was one of the things about her. She didn't look away from things even when they were uncomfortable, which was not a quality he had expected from her and which he had come to respect more than he had words for. I was wrong, she said. I've been wrong before. The difference is what you do with it. You've been doing a lot. So have you. He looked at her. She looked at him. The June evening moved around them. Other people from the event passing on the steps, the distant sound of the river, the city settling into its summer self. Miles likes you, he said. I know. A pause. I like him too. He's a remarkable kid. He's a pain in my neck. Also that. He turned back to the river, thought about what it meant to stop looking at a future in the past tense, to stop thinking of what used to be and start thinking of what was actually in front of you, not as a betrayal of the one that ended, but as the honest acknowledgement that life was long and you were still in it. Renata had been 30. He was 35. Miles would be 10 in November. Time moved the way it moved, and standing still in the face of it was not loyalty. It was just standing still. Ask me again, he said, about the board dinner. She looked at him. She understood what he was saying. She was not a person who needed things spelled out. Would you come to the board dinner with me? She said. Second Thursday in July. He considered it. What do I wear? He asked. Something that isn't the jacket you've had on every time I've seen you in a formal context. What's wrong with the jacket? Nothing's wrong with it. I just think you own other things. I'll think about it. That's a yes. That's an I'll think about it, she smiled. Properly this time, with the full weight of it. It was not a smile she gave many people, he had learned. He had seen how she was in rooms, the professional warmth, the calibrated openness. This was different from that. This was the version without the calibration. He stored it the way he stored things that mattered. The story that gets told later usually flattens it. It becomes a tattooed single father, a brilliant CEO, a corporate conspiracy, justice served, unlikely love. The version with clean lines and a satisfying shape, the kind you can describe in a sentence, that version is not wrong exactly. It just leaves out the texture. It leaves out Gerald sitting in a lawn chair in the alley every Saturday morning that first winter, close enough to be present and far enough to be polite, because Jackson had needed someone nearby and hadn't known how to ask. It leaves out Miles spending 3 weeks asking careful, indirect questions about his mother before finally asking the direct one, and the 2 hours that followed at the kitchen table. It leaves out Vivian sitting alone in her office at 6 in the morning for weeks after the board meeting, running and rerunning the decisions she had made, not because she regretted them, but because she was the kind of person who examined her choices afterward the way Jackson examined machines, to understand the logic, to find what could be improved. It leaves out how long things actually took, how imperfect the people were, how many times the right thing was not the easy thing and not the obvious thing and was arrived at badly, with wrong turns and poor timing and the kind of conversations that started in the wrong place before finding their way to the right one. What happened between Jackson Reed and Vivian Cross was not a clean arc. It was two damaged people learning, slowly and imperfectly, that they were capable of being in the same room with someone without bracing for the loss of them. That is a harder thing than it sounds. That is the actual thing. The stuff about the patents and the company and the justice served. That matters. It mattered to Jackson in a way that went bone deep. The restoration of something that had been taken in the worst year of his life. It mattered to the families the foundation helped. Real people with real conditions and real financial weight lifted by funds that had finally gone where they were supposed to go. It mattered to Leonard Cross, who died 14 months later in his sleep, peacefully, having spent his last year in the particular freedom of a man who has finally told the truth he owed. But what Jackson would say, if you asked him, and he was not a man you would easily get to answer that question, is that the thing that mattered most was smaller and less dramatic than any of that. It was a Saturday morning in the workshop, some months after the board dinner, which had been as tedious as advertised and which he had somehow found himself not minding. Miles was at the table in the back. Vivian was at the workbench, working on the small tabletop press that had become her standing project, with a concentration that had improved considerably over the months. The space heater was going. The linotype stood in its corner, finally fully functional after the replacement of a timing gear that had taken Jackson 3 weeks to fabricate. He was doing nothing in particular, standing in his workshop, watching the morning come through the upper windows. There was no dramatic moment, no resolution announced by the atmosphere. The light was ordinary, the machines were ordinary. His son was doing something with a pencil that probably was not homework. Vivian was swearing quietly at the ink channel she would eventually master and hadn't yet. It was a Tuesday, or a Thursday. He couldn't remember afterward. What he remembered was standing in his workshop with the people who had become, without his having planned it or asked for it or fully recognized it as it was happening, his. Not the romantic version of that word, and not the possessive version. The version that meant, these people are part of the structure now, part of what holds the rest of it up. He had been a man who was very good at fixing broken machines, who understood that you started not with the part that was broken, but with what the machine was designed to do. You worked backward from the purpose. You traced the logic. You found the point of failure. He had been broken for a while. He had, in the way that broken things sometimes managed, found his way back to his purpose. Renata would have had thoughts about Vivian. She would have taken exactly as long as she needed to form them, and then said them with the directness that had been her particular gift to everyone who knew her. She would have noticed what he was slow to notice, and told him at a moment he was not expecting. He thought about that sometimes. What she would have said. He thought she would have said, "It's still good, even if it took a long time," which was what Miles had said at the kitchen table, pasta sauce on his chin, because children carry more of their lost parents than anyone plans for. And sometimes the true thing comes out of them at the exact moment it is needed, and they don't even know they've done it. Jackson Reed stood in his workshop on a morning that was not dramatic and was not a culmination and was only exactly what it was. A morning in the life of a man who had built something true and lost it and stayed standing and been handed, eventually, the chance to build again. He picked up a wrench. He went back to work.